Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be talking about something that's, well, really important for anybody who's thinking about getting into farming, especially if sustainability is, kind of the core of what you want to do.
All right.
So we're talking about tech and agriculture, and specifically, all these advancements like in AI and how they're opening up these new possibilities for new farmers,
Mm.
even potentially creating new revenue streams and kind of proving that, all these environmentally friendly practices you might be considering, they're not just good for the planet, they could be good for your bottom line too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And to do that, we've pulled together a bunch of different info, stuff about AI in carbon offsetting, the realities of actually working with soil carbon markets, the whole big picture of carbon credits, how AI is being used to track emissions in agriculture, and some pretty cool solutions that are being developed to help farmers participate in these, kind of new and always changing markets.
Yep, exactly. And today, our goal is to put all that together for you,
Hmm.
in a way that makes sense, in a way that's useful. We want to show you how all these trends, they can actually have a direct impact on new farms, farms that are focused on sustainability, and they can actually offer a path to, making your farm financially viable. So let's start by talking about AI, this whole idea of climate scoring. What's that all about?
Well, one of the really interesting things is that AI is playing a bigger and bigger role in how we understand and manage carbon emissions, right? And of course, agriculture is a big part of that. And we're seeing AI being used in these really fascinating ways, particularly when it comes to monitoring and verifying carbon offsets.
Yeah, think about it. Trying to track the carbon footprint of like a whole agricultural supply chain, that's a huge, huge task. But with these machine learning algorithms, we can now analyze tons of data, everything from satellite images to readings from sensors on the ground, even transaction records. And it all comes together to give you this much more complete picture, like where are the emissions coming from? Where can we make the biggest reductions, right? And the takeaway here is that because of AI, we're getting much better at measuring carbon. And for new farmers, that means, those sustainable practices you're using, they're more likely to be recognized and rewarded, even financially.
Absolutely. And there are companies like Pushima, for example, that are using AI and remote sensing to map forest carbon. And that's really helpful because it helps to make sure that reforestation and conservation projects are legit, that they're actually doing what they say they're doing. And it helps prevent these phantom credits, credits that don't actually represent real carbon being removed from the atmosphere.
Yeah, that's super important for building trust in the whole system.
Exactly.
And it's not just about, seeing what's happening out there. AI is also making the carbon offset projects themselves more accurate and reliable. By automating the way we collect data, analyze it, and verify it, we can really cut down on the chances of errors or even, fraud.
Yeah. And that leads to more transparency and accountability, which is crucial for building confidence in the whole carbon offset market, right?
Right.
And when we look at the bigger picture, we can see that AI is also streamlining how carbon credits are managed and traded. We're seeing these smart automated platforms being developed that can connect buyers and sellers, find the best prices, and even make sure transactions are secure using blockchain technology. And that's really important because it makes it easier and cheaper for everyone to participate in these markets, which is good news for new farmers who might not have a lot of resources to start with.
Now let's talk about something that's really interesting, especially for anyone who's thinking about, storing carbon in their soil, like using practices like no-till farming or cover cropping. Because while the idea of, getting paid for the carbon your soil is storing sounds great, actually measuring those gains accurately, that's been a pretty big challenge, hasn't it?
Absolutely. It's not always a simple thing. The way carbon behaves in soil, it's really complex. It's affected by so many different things. So for new farmers, it's really important to keep up with the latest developments in measurement techniques and, maybe focus on practices that have more easily verifiable carbon benefits, at least in the short term.
Yeah, exactly. And even the models we use now to estimate soil carbon, they're helpful, but they can't always fully capture all the complex biological stuff that's happening underground.
Right.
Plus, accurately measuring nitrous oxide emissions, which come from using fertilizers, that's another big hurdle.
But the really cool thing is that AI is starting to be used to tackle these very uncertainties. Like that study you mentioned from the University of Minnesota, they're using AI to track carbon emissions on farms. And what's really exciting is that it has the potential to pinpoint exactly where those pollutants are coming from and make our carbon tracking way more accurate.
And their findings are pretty amazing. They fed the AI data from existing models, and it actually ended up being way more accurate than those models were on their own. And this kind of AI-driven tracking, It's becoming even more important now, especially with all the money that's been put into climate-smart agriculture and the Inflation Reduction Act. We really need to be able to verify the real impact of all these different farming practices.
Absolutely. So AI has this huge potential to make our carbon measurements more rigorous and more accurate. And that's essential if we want to build a credible market, right?
Right.
Because ultimately, we want to make sure that farmers are being fairly rewarded for managing their land sustainably.
Now, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the really cool solutions that are being developed by startups in this space. Companies that are focused on carbon sequestration and making it easier for farmers to get involved in these carbon markets.
Yeah, this is where we see some really practical applications starting to emerge. Like, there's this startup called Working Trees, and they're specifically focused on helping farmers get paid for the carbon that's stored in trees, in silvopasture systems.
And just to clarify for anyone who's new to that term, silvopasture basically means integrating trees and grazing livestock on the same piece of land.
Right.
It's a win-win because the trees provide shade for the animals and extra forage, but they're also sucking up carbon from the atmosphere.
Exactly. And what makes Working Trees so interesting is their technology. They've developed this smartphone app, and farmers can use it to measure, the diameter of the trees, the height, even the species. And then the app uses that data to figure out how much carbon is being stored.
Yeah, that's amazing. So if I'm a new farmer and I'm interested in silvopasture, my first step might be to check out their app.
Yeah.
And see how it works and how it helps me measure all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that ability for farmers to gather that ground level data,
Yeah.
that's huge.
Yeah.
Because instead of just relying on, satellite images, which can sometimes miss important details,
Yeah.
the farmers themselves are providing real, verifiable measurements from their own land. And that's a big deal for making this whole thing more accessible.
It is, and it's worth mentioning that Working Trees actually launched the first ever agroforestry carbon project in the US. So it's not just a cool idea, it's actually working in the real world.
Yeah.
And that opens up a real pathway for farmers who are interested in this approach.
And another thing that's really great about Working Trees is that they're really focused on bringing down the cost of monitoring and verification, because those costs can be a big barrier, especially for smaller farmers who want to get involved in carbon markets. So by making the process simpler with their technology, they're making it possible for more farmers to participate.
Yeah, exactly. And their model of, pre-selling carbon credits is really clever too, because it gives farmers that money up front, so they can actually get started with these silvopasture systems. And that's super important because, the benefits of planting trees, both in terms of the carbon they store and the potential income they generate, it takes time. So having that immediate financial support can make a big difference for new farmers who are making those long-term investments.
Okay, so we've talked about how AI is helping us track carbon and how these innovative solutions are making it easier for farmers to get involved. But there's a big question here, right? How do we know that these carbon credits are legit? How do we verify that they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Right. This is a huge deal for the whole market. I mean, we need to make sure it's credible. And first, it's important to understand the difference between carbon credits, which are basically like permission slips to emit a certain amount of greenhouse gas, and carbon offsets, which are like compensation for removing or reducing emissions somewhere else.
Right.
And then we have two main types of carbon markets: compliance markets, which are usually regulated by the government, and voluntary markets. And for new farms, especially those that are focused on sustainability, the voluntary carbon market is probably where you'll find the most opportunities to generate income from carbon offsets.
Exactly. And in that voluntary market, which is where a lot of agricultural offsets are traded, third-party verification is absolutely key. These independent organizations, they're like the auditors of the carbon world. They come in and make sure that the claimed emission reductions are real, that they're actually happening, and that they're going to last, as resources like carboncredits.com explain.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are well-established organizations like Vera and Gold Standard that play a big role in providing that assurance. And we're also seeing new standards emerge, like the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, or ICVCM with their core carbon principles. And that's really encouraging because it means there's a push to set these global benchmarks for high-quality carbon credits, which is going to build more trust and transparency in the market.
Right.
Plus, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, is making their verification processes even stronger for companies that are claiming to be net zero, which also has an impact on the demand for high-quality offsets.
Yeah. And going back to those phantom credits we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
the ones that don't actually represent real emission reductions, AI and these really strict verification processes are our best defense against them. So by having transparent and auditable data through the whole process,
Yeah.
we can be more confident that a carbon credit is actually doing what it says it's doing, right?
Yeah, exactly. It really comes down to, is this actually making a difference?
Right.
And that brings us to the whole issue of permanence, particularly when it comes to carbon storage in soil.
Right.
Because there is some skepticism out there, about how long that carbon will actually stay locked up in the soil, especially since these carbon offset projects often have commitments that last for decades.
Yeah. Things can change, right? Like
Yeah.
land management practices down the line or even natural events, they could release that stored carbon back into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So it's great to see companies like Indigo taking a proactive approach. They're actually putting a portion of the carbon credits they generate into a buffer pool to cover any potential reversals.
And that kind of forward thinking is really important for the long-term health of the carbon market.
Absolutely.
It creates a safety net and makes the offsets more reliable.
Okay, so if we take all of this into account, what does the future look like for sustainable farming? Especially for those who are just starting out.
Well, I think if we look at all this information together, a really positive picture starts to emerge. AI is giving us these more accurate insights into which sustainable practices are actually working, which ones are best at storing carbon and reducing emissions. And that means that the carbon credits that farmers earn for using those methods are going to be more reliable and more valuable.
Right. And the voluntary carbon market itself is growing like crazy. Predictions are showing huge growth in the next few years. So for a new farmer, that potential growth could be a really big factor in their long-term success.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that farmers are the key players in generating these offsets. Whether they're installing solar panels, making their operations more energy efficient, capturing carbon and methane, or managing their land and forests responsibly, they're the ones on the front lines of climate action.
And we can't forget about blue carbon credits either. These are credits that come from marine ecosystems like mangroves and seagrass beds. And those ecosystems can store way more carbon than forests on land, which means they can command a higher price in the market. So for farms that are near the coast or have wetlands, that could be a really great opportunity to explore.
Absolutely. And the fact that startups like Working Trees are popping up is really encouraging. They're showing us how technology can make it easier for farmers of all sizes to get involved in carbon market.
Yeah, that's great.
And that's essential if we want to see more widespread adoption of these sustainable practices.
Of course, as we've been talking about, it's important to be careful when you're dealing with carbon credits. Make sure you're choosing high-quality credits, ones that have been verified, and make sure you're working with reputable programs. That way you know you're getting real value and that you're actually making a difference.
Absolutely. Now, as a bonus insight, let's talk about some concrete things that new farmers can do to really maximize their carbon credit revenue and turn their farms into, sustainability powerhouses.
Sounds good. So for those of you who are just starting out or thinking about making the switch to more sustainable methods, understanding how this carbon market works can give you a real financial advantage on top of all the environmental benefits.
Absolutely. So the first thing is to do your research and make sure you're using practices that are known to work, practices that are scientifically proven to store carbon in both the soil and the plants themselves. We're talking about things like no-till farming, using cover crops consistently, and integrating trees into your operation through silvopasture.
And this might seem obvious, but keep good records of everything you do. All those sustainable practices you're using, write them down, keep track of them, because that data is going to be super important when it comes to verifying your carbon credits. Remember how the Working Trees app makes it easy to track those tree measurements? Well, you'll need that same level of detail for your soil-based practices.
Right.
And think about how that AI tracking study relied on having all that data.
Exactly.
It's all connected.
And it's a good idea to look into partnering with companies like Indigo and Working Trees. They've already built these platforms and technologies that make it easier to generate and sell carbon credits. Plus, they can help you navigate the whole process, which can be pretty complex.
Definitely. And staying up to date on how the carbon market is changing is really important too.
Yeah.
Keep an eye on organizations like the IC, VCM, and SBTI. See what they're doing. The more you know, the better decisions you'll be able to make.
Yeah.
And if your farm is near the coast or has wetlands, or if you have the opportunity to restore those areas, definitely look into blue carbon credits.
Right.
As we learned, those can be really valuable.
Yeah. And finally, don't be afraid to reach out for help. There are tons of educational resources out there, and you can always consult with experts who specialize in carbon markets because this is a complex field, and getting expert advice can save you a lot of time and make sure you're setting yourself up for success.
So to wrap up today's deep dive, we talked about how AI is becoming this really powerful tool for making our carbon tracking more accurate and making those carbon markets work better. We saw how startups are coming up with these really cool solutions that make it easier for farmers to get involved. And we talked about how important it is to make sure those carbon credits are legit. The bottom line is sustainable farming, it's not just good for the planet, it's becoming a real economic opportunity.
Right. And we hope this has given you a good foundation for understanding how all this works. It's a lot to take in, but we encourage you to keep learning about the things that interest you and that are relevant to your farm, whether you're just getting started or already have one.
And that brings us to one final thought. As technology keeps advancing at this crazy pace, and the need to address climate change becomes even more urgent, how is this all going to change the future of agriculture? How is it going to reward the farmers who are prioritizing sustainability from the very beginning? That's something to think about as you start your farming journey. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.